These 12 practical hacks were learned the hard way by grandmas who had no choice but to make do with what they had. There were no big budgets, no modern gadgets, and no room for waste. Every item had value, every scrap had a purpose, and every decision was about getting the most out of the least. These hacks weren't about being trendy or clever, they were everyday solutions to real-life problems. Whether it was using leftover bones to make broth, turning bacon grease into cooking oil, or saving electricity with the one light bulb rule, each of these habits came from lived experience during hard times. What's surprising is how useful these tricks still are today. In a world filled with overconsumption and rising costs, these old-school methods are not only smart, they're more relevant than ever. Whether you're looking to cut down on bills, reduce waste, or just live a little more intentionally, these tips from Grandma's era might be exactly what you need. Number 1. One light bulb rule. Grandma didn't waste electricity like people often do today. If she wasn't using a room, the light was off. Simple. She followed what some would call the one light bulb rule. It wasn't written anywhere, but you could see it in how she lived. There might have been 10 light bulbs in the house, but only one ever lit up at a time. The one where she was actually doing something. Cooking, sewing, reading, folding clothes. The rest? Dark. To her, leaving lights on when nobody was using them was the same as throwing money away. It wasn't about being cheap. It was about respecting what you had and using it wisely. Back then, every penny counted. One extra dollar on the electricity bill meant less money for groceries or a needed repair. And it wasn't just lights, this mindset spilled into everything. Turning off the radio if no one was listening, unplugging things when not in use, not running the oven just to warm the kitchen. It was awareness. Constant awareness. Today, most of us walk around with lights blazing in every room, TVs running in the background, chargers sucking power 24/7. But try living like Grandma for 1 week. Just one light on at a time. You'll start noticing how often electricity gets wasted for no real reason. You'll begin to appreciate the small difference it makes. Multiply that by weeks, by months, by a full year, and the savings add up. Grandma didn't need an energy-efficient label or a smart home app. She was the smart part of the home. And all it took was a habit she built the hard way, by living through times when wasting wasn't an option. Number 2, chicken bones aren't trash. When Grandma made a chicken dinner, she saw more than one meal on that plate. Sure, you'd eat the drumsticks, maybe carve off the breast meat, but the bones? Those were just getting started. She'd collect every single one, even if they'd already been picked over. They went into a bag in the freezer, along with onion skins, celery tops, carrot ends, anything with flavor. That was her stockpile, literally. When the bag was full, she pulled out a big pot and made broth. She didn't see bones as garbage. She saw them as ingredients. Simmer them low and slow with a pinch of salt, maybe a bay leaf if she had it, and the kitchen would smell like home. What came out was a golden, rich broth, better than anything in a can. She used it for soup, rice, sauces, or even to sip on cold days. This wasn't just about flavor. It was about stretching what she had. One chicken could feed a family 3 times, once as a roast, once in a pot of soup, and maybe again as a gravy or stew. That kind of thrift came from hard times. Food wasn't something you wasted. It was something you respected. Nowadays, most people throw away bones without thinking. But if you're trying to save money, build flavor, and waste less, this old trick is pure gold. Next time you have a roast chicken, save the bones. Add some scraps, boil it up, and see what Grandma already knew. Nothing should go to waste if it still has something to give. Number 3, reusing bacon grease. In Grandma's kitchen, nothing got thrown out that still had flavor, and bacon grease was like liquid gold. After cooking bacon, she'd carefully pour the grease into a jar, usually an old coffee tin or mason jar, and let it cool. She'd keep it near the stove or tucked in the fridge, depending on the season. That jar wasn't just a habit, it was a secret ingredient. She used that bacon grease to cook eggs, fry potatoes, saute vegetables, and even make cornbread. Just a spoonful turned simple ingredients into something that tasted rich and comforting. If you've ever had green beans or cabbage cooked in bacon grease, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It brings that depth of flavor you can't fake with olive oil or butter. It also saved money. Instead of using fresh oil or butter every time, she'd dip into that jar. Over a month, that added up. No need to buy cooking spray or expensive oils when she already had something packed with flavor sitting right there. And she was smart about it too. She'd strain it through cheesecloth or an old coffee filter to remove the bits, keeping it clean and ready for next time. If it started to smell off, she knew it was time to toss it, but that rarely happened. She used it too fast. What some people saw as leftover grease, Grandma saw as the base of her next meal. It wasn't greasy fast food thinking. It was thoughtful cooking with what you had. That's real kitchen wisdom, learned from doing more with less. Number 4, safety pins fix everything. Grandma didn't panic over wardrobe malfunctions. She didn't need a sewing kit in every room or rush to replace something just because it ripped. She had safety pins, and lots of them. Little metal lifesavers that she stashed in cookie tins, sewing drawers, coat pockets, even stuck on the inside of her purse. If something broke or came loose, she had a pin ready to go. Button popped off before church, safety pin. Skirt hem coming undone at the grocery store, pin it, keep walking. Purse strap coming apart mid-trip, pin it until she could sew it or fix it properly. Sometimes the pin stayed there for months, not just a few minutes. This wasn't laziness. It was practicality. Safety pins were cheap, strong, and did the job right then and there, and she trusted them. When something broke, she didn't throw it away. She stabilized it, extended its life, and kept on moving. She also used them creatively. A pin could replace a broken zipper pull, hold curtains closed, fasten a cloth into a makeshift apron. I've even seen her use one to remove a splinter. It was like she had a Swiss Army knife in pin form. Today, we think everything needs to be replaced, reordered, or repaired by someone else. But back then, Grandma solved problems herself. A pack of safety pins cost less than $1, but to her, it was worth 10 times that in usefulness. She learned it from hard times, times when there was no backup pair of jeans or money for a new handbag. Just you, your wits, and a handful of safety pins. And honestly, that's still one of the smartest tools you can keep around. Number 5, no heat ironing hack. There was no panic in Grandma's house when the iron stopped working, or when there simply wasn't one around. She didn't run to the store or wait for a sale. She had an old school trick, learned through experience that worked surprisingly well. She used the mattress. That's right. Wrinkled shirt, fold it neatly, lay it flat under the mattress overnight, and let gravity do the ironing for you. She wasn't looking for a perfectly pressed, starched look. She just wanted the clothes to be presentable, clean, tidy, and without deep creases. This method worked best with cotton shirts, trousers, and pillowcases. The key was folding it right, lay the garment as flat as possible, smooth out the wrinkles with your hands, and then place it beneath the mattress where it could get full pressure. By morning, it came out visibly smoother, sometimes wrinkle-free depending on the fabric. It sounds funny now, but it was practical. Back then, electricity wasn't something you used carelessly. Irons consumed a lot of power, and if you were already stretching your bills thin, using one daily felt like a luxury. Plus, some homes didn't even have reliable electricity in certain areas, or the iron itself cost more than Grandma was willing to spend. Why burn through energy when you could fix the problem while you slept? She even used this trick to iron clothes in bulk. On laundry day, she'd stack a few pieces one on top of another, press them under the mattress, and rotate them the next night. Over time, she developed a rhythm, and the family always had smooth enough clothes for school, work, or church. This wasn't just about saving money. It was about problem solving with what you had. Grandma didn't see limitations as a roadblock. She saw them as a challenge to outsmart, and she did, quietly, without complaining, using nothing but a mattress and a little patience. It's the kind of solution you don't learn from Pinterest or TikTok. It comes from years of figuring things out the hard way and knowing that good enough is often more than enough. That's the heart of all her hacks. Not perfection, but practicality. And this mattress trick? It's still genius today, especially if you're in a hurry, out of tools, or just trying to keep your power bill down. Number 6, jar saver mentality. Back in the day, glass jars weren't just packaging, they were resources. Grandma saw them for what they really were: durable, versatile, and endlessly reusable containers. Whether it was a jelly jar, a pickle jar, or a peanut butter jar, nothing with a lid ever got thrown out without being cleaned and repurposed. She didn't call it upcycling or zero waste living. It was just what you did when buying new containers wasn't always an option and you made the most out of what came through your kitchen. After the contents were gone, she'd soak the jar in warm water to remove the label. Sometimes she used a bit of vinegar or baking soda to help with the sticky glue left behind. Once cleaned, the jar was as good as new in her eyes and ready for its second life. Different sizes had different uses. Tall pasta sauce jars were great for dry goods like rice, beans, or flour. Shorter jars were for leftovers, homemade dressings, salad scraps, or fruit compote. She'd store gravy in one, bacon fat in another, or even soak garlic cloves in vinegar to make her own flavored oil later on. Lids were essential. A good screw-top lid was worth more than the jar itself. She'd keep extras just in case one got dented or rusted. If a lid fit tightly and didn't leak, that jar was staying in rotation for years. Some even ended up as drinking glasses, especially the jelly jars with the wider mouths. Others held sewing supplies, buttons, needles, pins, or bits of thread. The garage had its own collection, too, filled with washers, screws, nails, bolts, and random little hardware pieces that somehow always came in handy. Each jar told a story, sometimes labeled with masking tape and a pencil note that had faded over the years, but still got the job done. She didn't care about aesthetics. Nothing matched, and that was fine. It was about function, not fashion. Today, people buy matching mason jars for kitchen organization or storage, but Grandma already had her own version, built up over time, one emptied food container at a time. She saw value where others saw trash. And it wasn't just about saving money, it was also about reducing waste, even if she wouldn't have put it in those words. It felt wrong to throw out something perfectly usable. Glass also lasts. It doesn't warp like plastic or stain with tomato sauce. It's safer for food, easier to clean, and doesn't retain odors. Grandma might not have known the science behind it, but she knew those old jars could handle a lot more than a flimsy plastic tub from the store. They went from fridge to freezer, sometimes even to the oven if needed, though always carefully. There was also something comforting about reaching into a pantry and seeing everything clearly stored in reused jars. Grains, dried beans, leftover soup, everything had its place, and you could always find what you needed. She didn't have to search for a missing lid because it screwed on. She didn't have to rebuy storage containers every year. She just kept using what she had, making it work year after year. That's not just a habit, that's a mindset. Number 7, bread ends equals crumbs. In a lot of kitchens today, the end slices of a loaf of bread, those slightly tougher, oddly shaped pieces, usually get ignored, pushed aside, or tossed straight into the trash. People call them heels or butts of the loaf, and most folks won't touch them unless they're desperate. But if you watched how Grandma handled bread, you'd see something completely different. For her, those pieces weren't useless. They were just the beginning of something else. When a loaf of bread got low and only the ends were left, Grandma didn't throw them out. Instead, she set them aside, usually on a small plate near the stove or on a tray by the window so they could air dry. There was no rush. She wasn't baking breadcrumbs that same day. She let them go hard and brittle over a couple of days, sometimes even longer. When she had enough, she'd collect them into a paper bag or an old tin and keep it sealed until it was time to make crumbs. Making breadcrumbs at home was a casual process. No fancy food processor or electric grinder. Grandma used whatever she had. Sometimes it was a rolling pin in a plastic bag. Sometimes it was the bottom of a glass jar and a cutting board. She'd crush those dry bread ends into fine or coarse crumbs, depending on what she planned to use them for. If she wanted a more uniform texture, she might toast them a bit more in the oven and then grind them again. The point is, she didn't need a machine, just time and a bit of patience. Those homemade breadcrumbs had a flavor and texture that you simply don't get from the store-bought kind. They weren't loaded with preservatives, salt, or mystery seasonings. They were made from real bread, often the same loaf she used for breakfast or sandwiches earlier that week. And because she made them herself, she could season them however she wanted, adding garlic powder, dried herbs, a pinch of pepper, or leaving them plain for more flexibility. Breadcrumbs weren't just a topping in her kitchen, they were a tool. She used them to coat chicken or pork chops, making a crunchy crust that soaked up flavor from whatever was cooking. They went on top of casseroles to give that golden, crisp layer everyone fights over. If she had a pot of soup or stew that was a little too thin, she'd throw in a handful of crumbs to thicken it, like a poor man's roux. Even meatballs and meatloaf relied on breadcrumbs to hold everything together without needing to use extra eggs or expensive filler. What's interesting is that this habit wasn't something she thought about consciously. It was just how things were done. Bread wasn't cheap back in the day, and wasting food, especially something as basic and useful as bread, just wasn't part of the mindset. Every part of the loaf had a purpose, even if that purpose came later. Today, this idea might seem like a quaint, old-fashioned hack, But if you look at the rising cost of groceries and how much food people waste, it's more relevant than ever. Making your own breadcrumbs saves money, reduces waste, and gives you a better product. And it starts with one small decision. Don't throw away those bread ends. Just let them dry out and use them when the time comes. Number 8. Cool down the oven. Slowly. In Grandma's house, every bit of warmth counted, especially in the colder months. She didn't just bake a pie or a roast and walk away once the food was done. She used the residual heat in that oven like it was a bonus source of warmth. The moment she turned the oven off, she'd crack the door open. Not all the way, just enough to let the warm air flow into the kitchen. That leftover heat was never wasted. It might seem like a small thing, but when you're living through long winters with a tight budget, small things make a big difference over time. She didn't rely on central heating to do all the work. Thermostats were kept low, barely above just enough, and she only turned up the heat if someone was sick or if the weather was brutally cold. Space heaters? Maybe, but only if absolutely necessary. Instead, she used what was already in motion. If she just used the oven to make dinner, why let that heat vanish? The oven had already done its job, so letting it slowly release that extra warmth was just smart. It also served another purpose, creating a cozy, welcoming environment without spending an extra dime. You could walk into her kitchen after dinner and feel the soft wave of heat that lingered, mixed with the smell of whatever she had just cooked. It wasn't artificial heat blasting from a vent. It was a more natural kind of warmth that made people want to stay in the room, pull up a chair, and settle in. And this wasn't just for baking. She did the same after roasting vegetables, baking bread, or even reheating leftovers. If the oven had been on for any reason, she treated the cool down like part of the process, not just an afterthought. She knew that ovens take time to cool anyway, so why not make that cooling work for you? Of course, she was always careful. She didn't leave the oven door wide open around kids or pets. She kept it cracked, managed it smartly, and treated it like a controlled source of comfort. It's the kind of habit most people today overlook, but for someone like Grandma, it was second nature. Not because she was obsessed with saving money, but because she respected what she had and made sure to use every last bit of it. Number 9. Pantyhose as filters. Pantyhose might not seem like the kind of thing you'd associate with home maintenance or DIY fixes, but for Grandma, they were one of those oddball items that turned out to be surprisingly useful around the house. When a pair got a run in them, or started to sag too much to wear, she didn't just toss them out. Instead, she repurposed them, often cutting them into smaller sections and storing the pieces in a drawer with other just-in-case supplies. What she saw wasn't a ruined pair of tights, it was material with a second life. One of the most practical ways she used pantyhose was as a filter. The material is incredibly fine and stretchy, which makes it perfect for catching small particles. For example, when painting something, like a door, a fence, or even a wall, she would pour the paint through a piece of pantyhose to strain out dried chunks or debris that might have settled in the can. This helped ensure the finish was smooth and consistent. Even professional painters use mesh filters for the same reason, but Grandma had figured it out decades ago with what she already had. She also used it in the kitchen, believe it or not. Loose leaf tea, spices, or even straining broth could be managed using pantyhose. She'd tie the ends or secure them with a rubber band, then drop it into the pot like a makeshift tea bag or bouquet garni. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. The material didn't break down easily in hot water, and it didn't hold flavors, especially if rinsed out quickly after use. Another spot where pantyhose came in handy was the vacuum cleaner. If she needed to retrieve a lost item, say an earring or a small screw, she'd slip a piece of pantyhose over the end of the vacuum hose and secure it with a rubber band. Then she'd turn on the vacuum and hover over the area. The suction would pull the item in, but the pantyhose would catch it before it disappeared into the machine. It was a clever way to fish things out of couch cushions, under furniture, or even the car floor. Some people also use strips of pantyhose in the garden, tying plants gently to stakes without damaging the stems. The fabric is soft but strong, and it holds up in the rain better than cotton string. Grandma always had a few pieces wrapped around tomato plants or climbing beans. All of this came from one worn-out pair of tights. Not something you'd expect to become a multi-purpose household tool, but when money was tight and trips to the store weren't convenient, that level of reuse made a real difference. Number 10. Tin can cooking tools. Back in the day, when money was tight and every household item had to earn its keep, Grandma saw value in things most people today wouldn't give a second glance, like an empty tin can. She didn't throw them out after opening a can of tomatoes or beans. She washed them, dried them, and set them aside because she knew they still had plenty of life left. What's impressive is how versatile those cans became in her hands, especially in the kitchen. She didn't have drawers full of specialty gadgets. What she had was resourcefulness. For example, she'd cut both ends off a clean can, smooth the edges with a file, or wrap them in a strip of cloth, and boom, she had a biscuit cutter. The metal ring was just the right size to press through dough, and it did the job as well as anything you'd buy. She made biscuits for breakfast, for dinner, sometimes even filled them with jam for dessert. The tool might have started as a soup can, but it turned into a kitchen essential without costing a thing. She didn't stop there. If she needed a scoop for flour, sugar, rice, or even pet food, she'd take a can and flatten one side. The curve of the metal gave it a natural grip, and she could pour or scoop easily. Some cans had a handle attached with wire or a bit of old string. It wasn't pretty, but it worked, and she used them for years. If she wanted a shaker for powdered sugar, flour, or cinnamon, she'd take a nail and poke holes in the bottom of a smaller can, then cover it when not in use. She could sift evenly and with control, perfect for topping pies or lightly dusting cookies. She even used them to sprinkle flour on a counter before rolling out dough. She found ways to turn cans into candle molds, cookie cutters, funnel replacements, and even small planters for herbs she kept near the window. Some cans ended up in the garage or garden for other uses. None of them went straight to the trash. Every can had potential. Grandma's tools weren't about appearance. They were about function, simplicity, and stretching what she had. In her world, usefulness always beat convenience. Tin cans weren't garbage. They were future tools, waiting to be used. And that kind of thinking made her kitchen endlessly practical, even when the budget was stretched thin. Number 11, toothbrushes live twice. One of the most underrated tools in Grandma's cleaning arsenal wasn't something fancy or expensive. It was a used toothbrush. When a toothbrush got too soft for brushing teeth, she didn't toss it in the trash. Instead, she gave it a second life as a detail cleaning brush. It wasn't about sentiment or habit. It was because those soft, compact bristles were genuinely useful for things that bigger brushes couldn't reach. She usually kept an old cup under the sink, and in it would be 2 or 3 used toothbrushes, each with a different job. One might be labeled bathroom, another for kitchen, and sometimes one had no label, used for whatever came up. That labeling was important. She made sure no one ever accidentally reused it for oral hygiene. Usually, she'd take a piece of masking tape and wrap it around the handle, or just scratch a mark into the plastic. Simple but effective. The thing about toothbrushes is they're perfect for narrow gaps, corners, seams, and grooves. Grandma used them to scrub around sink drains where grime tends to build up, and cloths just push dirt around. They were ideal for tile grout lines, those narrow, recessed spaces between tiles that are notorious for trapping dirt and soap scum. With a bit of baking soda and vinegar or dish soap, that old toothbrush worked like a miniature power tool. She also used them to clean shoe soles, especially those ridged athletic ones that pick up all kinds of street debris. With some warm, soapy water and a few scrubs, even white sneakers came back to life. The same brush might help clean the hinges on a cabinet, the track of a sliding window, or even the buttons on the stove where grease collects. Their size gave her precision, and she didn't need to put much pressure to get real results. And because the brushes were already destined for the trash, she wasn't afraid to use them for messy jobs. Once the bristles were completely flattened or bent beyond use, they finally went out. But even then, she sometimes used the handle as a stir stick for small paint jobs or glue applications. Not a single part was wasted until it absolutely had to be. This wasn't just a clever trick, it was a practical mindset. Something doesn't stop being useful just because its first job is done. A toothbrush might start in the bathroom cabinet, but in Grandma's house, it ended its life helping keep every nook and cranny spotless. Number 12. Ice water equals fluffy eggs. If there's one thing Grandma understood, it was how to make basic ingredients go further, without anyone at the table realizing it. Eggs were a perfect example. Back in her day, you didn't crack open 6 or 8 eggs just to make breakfast for 2 people. Eggs were more expensive proportionally, and when you had a big family to feed or guests stopping by unannounced, stretching ingredients without sacrificing texture or taste was just something you figured out. That's where this ice water trick came in. Right before she whisked the eggs for scrambling, she'd add about a tablespoon of very cold water. Ice water if she had it. The idea was simple, but the result was impressive. When those water-infused eggs hit a hot pan, the water would quickly turn into steam, puffing up the eggs from the inside. This extra steam made them lighter, airier, and gave the illusion of more volume than you actually started with. It didn't change the flavor, but it changed the feel of the dish. The eggs didn't come out dense or rubbery like they sometimes do when overcooked. They stayed soft and tender, even if you were only using 3 or 4 eggs for several servings. No need for cream or milk or fancy techniques, just cold water, a fork, and a little wrist action. She didn't measure with teaspoons or timers either. It was all by feel. The water had to be cold, but not so much that it diluted the egg flavor. The pan had to be hot, but not scorching. She usually used a bit of bacon grease or butter to coat the pan, and she'd stir gently, never overwork them. Let the eggs set a bit, then fold slowly from the edges. You didn't want to scramble them aggressively like some diner short-order cook. You wanted gentle, tender curds. This hack also had a budget benefit. It let her use fewer eggs while still filling plates. If you had limited ingredients and hungry mouths, this made a real difference. It sounds small, but when you cook every day for decades, those small tweaks are what keep a home kitchen running. Most people today might look for the next gadget or fancy chef's secret, but Grandma's ice water method proves that the smartest cooking hacks are usually the simplest and the ones learned through experience, not instructions.